story goes that after one issue of Batman, Bill Finger, the writer, and Bob Kane, the artist of the Batman saga, were troubled that Batman didn't have anybody to talk to.
When Bob Kane first got the idea for Batman, he conceived of him as a lone vigilante. And Bill Finger, of course, was writing the stories and the dialogue, and he kept finding that it was very hard to write dialogue for a character that was a solo character.
Well, you didn't even have thought balloons much in comics in those days. And the idea of interior monologue, whether in thought balloon or in a sort of voiceover kind of caption narration, the way we do it more often these days, was very infrequent. Normally you spoke only when you spoke. And in Batman's case, that wasn't very often.
And what's interesting with Batman is the master detective, how he figures things out. If he has no one to explain this to, it gets really odd, and it's all in his head and it becomes less impressive.
I mean, you had other characters for Batman to get exposition out through, whether it was a relationship with Alfred later on or Commissioner Gordon, but those are different type of relationships and they can only go so far. If the two people are sharing an adventure together, there can be a lot more discussion about how the events are unfolding or what the thought process are in regards to what they're doing.
And what happens next intrigues me as someone who loves mythology and psychology. Kane has to think of somebody for Batman to talk to. And what happens in his imagination is that he goes back into his own youth, and he seems to recall going to the matinee movies and watching Douglas Fairbanks Sr. in movies like The Pirate and Robin Hood, and fantasizing that he is in the movie with Douglas Fairbanks. He's kind of the sidekick to this great hero. And so naturally he trusts this impulse that the hero has someone there beside him.
So they had to give this character a name, and the name was Robin.
The story of Robin evolves over the years, and you really don't have a full, detailed origin of the character till the mid-60s. The essence of the tale always was the setting of the circus. The parents were the Flying Graysons, family of acrobats. Dick was a budding young acrobat, which helped justify later what he did in action with Batman. And someone comes and begins threatening the circus if they don't get protection money. And when not paid the protection money, ends up killing the Graysons. And Dick survives.
Dick Grayson's origin is very similar to Batman's in that, you know, it's the loss of parents. It's kind of a key theme that runs through all the Robins. You know, so in that, it makes it very easy to see why Batman would take on this young child, because he sees himself inside of him.
The parallelism that they wanted to develop about Robin's origin was to again have a fairly young person go through the tragedy of losing their family. The difference in the case of Robin is that he was old enough to sort of have a more developed consciousness about it and to do something about it and to be involved in the process of finding the killer.
He's not as obsessed. He can never be as obsessed as Bruce Wayne is.
To be realistic, there is a very big difference between having your parents gunned down in front of you in the streets and then having them plunge to their deaths as trapeze artists, because that's what they live with every day. The danger that they lived with every day, every time they went up there to the wires, that they might fall, because they worked without a net. So I didn't think it was something beyond Dick Grayson's comprehension that his parents might someday fall to their death.
I think you react differently to any particular tragedy or stimulus at different ages. If your parents were murdered in front of you while you were 2 years old, you probably wouldn't comprehend what was going on. And undoubtedly you'd grow up with some psychological burden because your parents wouldn't be part of your life, but the moment wouldn't be that critical. If you're 8, the way Bruce Wayne was portrayed, you're old enough to get it, you're old enough to understand, and you're fundamentally very helpless. And I think that helplessness creates an extraordinary level of anger. Because Dick Grayson goes through that trauma at perhaps 15, perhaps 16. At some level, the tragedy is taking place at the moment when you're already supposed to be leaving the nest. And it's just accelerating a process.
Mythically and dramatically, the only way that you can create a character who's going to transcend this urge for vengeance is by instilling in these characters a moment of compassion, of hope in early childhood.
For Dick, it was just over and done with. You know, vengeance has been had, and quickly, justice was served. So I think from his inception, he was able to see that this works, that we as the good guys can put away the bad guys.
It was one of the most brilliant masterstrokes I think anyone ever came up with, because what it did instantly was to humanize Batman. There is a factor and an element of him. He is obsessive, he is relentless, and he can be really inhuman. Robin serves the reminder factor. You remind him that who he is doing this for. Not just for revenge, not just to get the people who killed his parents, but to save the people like Robin, to save the human beings.
Pop psychologists would make the argument that there's only a handful of very fundamental relationships people recognize. Either a parent-child mode, or a child-parent mode, or a peer-to-peer mode. These are sort of the natural relationships we're programmed for.
Well, if you're going to play up the father-son relationship, even a teacher-student relationship, or even a generational relationship, or even the fact that one person is intensely driven and the other one is a little more of a free spirit, there's going to have to be conflict between the two characters. There's going to have to be two different points of view.
Batman was significantly older, you know, than Robin, so that is the natural, you know, natural relationship that's going to develop. You know, teacher and mentee, father and son.
The way Bill Finger describes it was that he was writing a big brother relationship rather than a father and son. But I think the father and son relationship crept in there as well. So there was a tension between Batman being a father figure and being a big brother figure.
Bob Kane had uncanny insight into the psychology of kids. It's a fascinating phrase, the fatherly big brother who will now take care of him and show him how to become a man. And in this process of the mentorship, the kid is completely free. It's the dream of all young teens.
It all comes from probably, I mean, you think knights and I guess they're squires, and how, you know, they'd follow the knights, they'd help them, and they'd eventually they grow into their own, and that's where, you know, that's where the father-son relationship might be a little softer, whereas the mentor relationship definitely is pushing for results.
It's a timeless story. It's something that every person experiences. You can see a lot of yourself in these characters, or what you wanted yourself to be in those characters. So I think as a reader, those are the things you can identify with and follow along simply.
Later, when we were worried about logic, we made him maybe the big brother you wouldn't have wanted except when you needed help. A tough love kind of character.
it was both an idealization and a normalization, and I think worked effectively on both levels.
This notion of Batman and Robin working in tandem is an ancient one. We've had this idea of bringing heroes together, from Jacob and Esau in the Old Testament to Romulus and Remus as the Roman heroes, Castor and Pollux, on some level Odysseus and Achilles. So what does this say? What's important is that they're each learning from each other, which is what we get in this wonderful tandem story of Batman and Robin.
The sidekick to the master detective, it's goes back to Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. It's the Lone Ranger and Tonto. It is student and teacher.
The Holmes-Watson relationship is one of the paradigms of detective fiction. Can you bring in a character who's smart enough to have a theory, but not smart enough to have the right theory? And then have the great detective raise his hand and say, ah, but if only you had considered that that clay could only come from that particular fuller's wheel, then you would have known, Watson.
It's very pleasing. We have a need for somebody who's a little smarter than we are. So that was another way of dealing with the Batman-Robin relationship. Mentor-student rather than father-son, and in some ways a more logical iteration of that, and certainly the one that I like the best.
Both characters are interested in justice, but if you had to weigh one against the other, Batman's still got vengeance predominantly in his mind, and Robin really just wants to bring the guys who did the wrong to justice. He's not out to get them as opposed to out to stop them, and I think it's a difference.